Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. We have been talking about our lives. Specifically, we've been asking the question, is life fragile? And what we have seen, from the scriptures is that it would be better to talk about our life as being dependent than it is fragile. We are dependent on the one who created us to sustain us and to make us eternal. Without him doing these things, it's not a matter of whether or not our life is fragile. We have no life apart from the one who creates and sustains and redeems, and ultimately, through his Son's death and resurrection, has promised to make us eternal. And so we have an answer, and yet I want to continue to do the study. I want you to continue to see basically the same thing over and over again, because the temptation for us is to try to make exceptions. The temptation is still for us to look at our lives and to have a certain amount of fear in terms of what could happen to us, because we recognize that if it's just us against the world, there are so many obstacles, so many challenges that are bigger than us that we cannot overcome. So we need this constant reminder that we are dependent, yes, but the one that we need has come in love. And so we don't have to be anxious. We don't have to be afraid. And today, I want to digress just a little bit. I've been thinking that, depending on who you are, maybe at what stage of life you're at, what you're dealing with, you may not be that afraid of being fragile or being broken. May not be afraid of death or dying or suffering or any of those things, at least not much. You're willing to take those things on. But where the issue of fragility challenges you the most, and I think this is true of many of us, isn't so much us and dealing with the possibility of something happening to us. It's more the issue of those people that God has put into our hands, right? The is your life fragile question isn't a question perhaps we care about that much when it comes to us. But when it comes to the people that we have a responsibility for, the people that we love, we can become very anxious when we see how fragile they look. And you may remember, if you're a parent, when God, through that doctor, put the baby, your little baby, in your hands for the very first time, and he or she was so small and so fragile that you were almost scared, if you didn't have a lot of baby experience, scared to hold the child. And perhaps in your mind you thought, what in the world have I gotten into? How can I take care of this child in such a way that he or she is safe, right? We've all had those feelings, those of us who are parents. But I as I thought about it, I was thinking back. I have 4 kids. Most of them are young adults now, and will soon be leaving the house. That creates all kinds of anxiety in a different way as a parent. But I started thinking back, reflecting a little bit before any of those kids were born. And you know what? My first experience with parental anxiety was when my wife was pregnant with our first child. We lived up in Wisconsin in those days, and we lived in a parsonage, which meant basically there was a house, and there was kind of a medium-sized field, and then there was a church up on the hill. And whenever my wife would leave the house and go down the road, she'd stop at a stop sign, and the church would be just up on a little hill, and my office would look down, and my desk would face the window, because I'm a daydreamer, right? And I would almost always notice, if I was in my office, I'd almost always notice if my wife was going somewhere. Now, some of you are going to think that I'm stalking my wife or something. I'm not, but I noticed, because I was facing in the direction of the window. And I don't remember exactly ever thinking much about it until after I found out that my wife was pregnant and that we were expecting our first child. I remember very distinctly looking out the window, seeing her stop at that stop sign, and having a moment of just complete terror. What if she went through that stop sign and a car came and hit them? I know that's dark. I know that's a weird. That may sound very strange, but it was my first moment of parental anxiety, of feeling completely out of control when it came to the life of this little child. There was nothing I thought that I could do if something like that happened, except watch through a window. It's depressing, I know, but this is what we deal with. We may not feel fragile. We may be bold when it comes to our own lives, but when we start having other people in our life that we care about and that we have responsibilities towards, this question of is your life fragile or is life fragile takes on a whole new meaning for us and a whole new challenge for us. And so this brings up an important question, and the question is this: how do we raise our children? Do we raise our children to look at their lives as fragile? Or should we be teaching them something else? You know there's a temptation, right? I mean, we see them going towards a dangerous situation, and we warn them away from it. And we may even tell them what might happen if they do it. Don't do this because something bad will happen. Don't do that because something bad will happen. If you do this, you could die. If you touch that, you could burn yourself. I mean, this is half of parenting, is guiding them away from potentially dangerous situations, grabbing them away from the busy road, teaching them to look both ways before they cross the street. And there's an implication, and I'm not saying those things are wrong. We are supposed to do those things. But if we're not careful, what we end up teaching our children is that their lives are fragile. Instead, what do we want to teach them? That their lives are dependent. And there are a couple examples of this in the scripture that pop into my head right away. The first one is the example of Job. You know the story of Job and all the suffering he went through. You know that his children, 7 of them, I believe they had, right? 7, perfect number. You may disagree as a parent. I'm just saying scripturally that's the perfect number, 7 children. And he in the very first chapter, they die. You probably know that. They're all in a house together, celebrating, having a party. Their father has provided for them very well, and they celebrate a lot. And they're all in a house together, and a big wind, perhaps a tornado, just knocks over the house and kills them all. Right? What's interesting is, before all the trouble hits Job, before his children are killed by the storm, we hear, before all that starts, we hear about Job, and we hear about all the blessings that God had given him. We hear about the blessing of his family, his children, and we get a glimpse into his worry, his anxiety. As I said, they often meet in one another's house and have celebrations, have parties. And Job is apparently concerned about them. And so right away at the very beginning, before anything bad happens, we hear what Job does with that anxiety. He makes sacrifices. He prays for them. He intercedes on their behalf. He becomes, as a father, he becomes almost like their great high priest, right? He makes sacrifices on their behalf, and he prays for them. He asks for God's blessing on them because he recognizes in the midst of all their celebrating and partying, something bad could happen. And the bad thing that he's scared might happen isn't the wind knocking the house down, even though that's terrible. The bad thing is he's afraid in the midst of all their celebration, in the midst of all the good things that they have, they may forget God. They may reject God. And so that is really what's at the heart of his prayer, because he recognizes that life isn't so much fragile, but it's dependent. And without God, dead or alive, they're not in a good situation. They need God in their life. There is no life apart from God. And so he prays for them. So the chapter begins with his describing his worry and his concern over his children and how he prays for them. And that's how he deals with that challenge. And the chapter ends with those children dying. Isn't that interesting? The other story that popped into my head was the story of Abraham. Of course, Abraham, God promises Abraham that he'll make him a great nation, And it's all going to begin with one son. And of course, his son is Isaac. He's born to he and his wife Sarah at a very old age. And it's the only son that he and Sarah ever have together. And at one point, God tells him to sacrifice that son. And he takes him to sacrifice him. Both of these situations, with Job and with Abraham, the issue of the fragility of their children's life is in play. Job deals with his anxiety by praying. Abraham deals with the anxiety, and you really have to read Hebrews chapter 11 to totally get it, because Hebrews chapter 11 helps us to get into the mind and the heart and the faith of Abraham. And we see with Abraham, he doesn't see Isaac as fragile. He sees Isaac as eternal. He believes in the resurrection. And he believes, even if it is God's will that he would sacrifice his son Isaac, that he will raise Isaac from the dead, because he has promised through Isaac there will be a great nation, and God won't break his promise. God never does. In fact, with Job, we see the same thing. The very heart and center of Job, after all, even more suffering that Job has to face, we see this great confession of faith where he says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end I will see him. With my own eyes I will see him in the flesh, right? So both of these men, they recognized their lives and the lives of those that had been put into their hands to care for were not fragile. They were dependent. And so for us as parents, yes, we want to guide our children. We want to help them see things that are dangerous and stay away from danger as much as possible. But we need to be careful, because we are not protecting them if we're stealing their zeal for God away. Instead, what we want to do is we want to show them God. We want to help them to understand how they are dependent on a Father in heaven who loves them so much that he sent his Son for them. We want them to see that nothing should get in the way of coming to the divine service where God the Son comes in the flesh to give his body and blood for the forgiveness of sins. And where there is forgiveness, there has to be life and salvation. We as parents have this responsibility, and it's not just parents. All of us have people that we care about, people whose lives, to some degree, we have some responsibility. In some sense, their lives are in our hands. What do we do with that? If their lives are in our hands, we hand them over in prayer to God. We pray to the Father in heaven, who loves them even more than we do, that he would preserve them, that he would forgive them. We intercede on their behalf, and then we talk to them about that Father in heaven who sent his Son, who loves them and who has redeemed them, who has made them eternal. And we never stop talking to them about that Father in heaven. Does that make sense? I really would be interested in some feedback here. The more I think about it, this is where we're scared. This is where we're scared, right? It's in this place where we have loved ones, right? It's not so much fear for ourselves. It's fear for those that we have some responsibility to. So I would encourage you to this week, if this is an anxiety that you have or a fear that you have, look again at Job chapter 1. Look again at Abraham in the book of Genesis, and then again in Hebrews 11 as it describes his great faith. Look at these wonderful examples of what to do with our anxiety when we're tempted to look at the people in our lives and see them as fragile. We pray that God would help you, that he'd help me to come to understand the distinction between fragile and dependent. And I pray that God would help us to communicate this important distinction to the people in our lives. God bless your week. We'll see you again next week.